Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the real reason why the Eldar are so broken in top-level competitive play. And I've gotten a lot of comments on my channel over the past month, really since 10th edition started, basically talking about how Eldar are broken and why they're broken. And, I've been hearing different people's opinions on why they're broken and what should be fixed about them, etc., etc. And when 10th edition came out and it was revealed that indeed Eldar were a little bit too strong, and by a little bit I mean probably about 10% higher than they should have been in competitive play, I did a video talking about why. And basically in that video I stated a few things. One, I stated that mortal wounds were not healthy for the game, and the fact that Eldar had such easy access to them in combination with Strands of Fate was not good, right? As you guys know, before the Strands of Fate nerf, Eldar could use as many Strands dice as they wanted, whenever they wanted. And this meant that units like the Wraith Knight could potentially one-round a lot of armies out there. With the combination of mortal wound damage, long range, and the towering keyword. Since then, the Eldar have seen several nerfs, but it doesn't seem like their tournament win rate is actually decreasing by all that much. Yeah, Strands of Fate got nerfed, but guess what? The Eldar tournament win rate did not really change all that much. In fact, it stayed relatively the same. Dropped a few points, but that's about it. And that has a lot of people in the Warhammer 40k community up in arms, basically saying that the whole codex needs a big nerf, every single unit in the codex is broken and undercosted, etc., etc. And while I have to admit, in the competitive scene, Eldar right now are very broken. The whole index itself is not. There's just a few problems that need to be fixed that are quite honestly toxic. And if you look at the different types of lists that have won tournaments for Eldar within the past month, you'll see that there are reoccurring themes. So in this video, I'm going to examine the real reason why the Eldar are broken to begin with as an experienced Eldar player, despite the several nerfs that the faction has already received since the introduction of 10th edition. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into it and find out why the Eldar are so fucking OP in 10th edition. Alright, but first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at what's going on with the Eldar in competitive play. We're going to be addressing common complaints about the Eldar in 10th edition, the real problem with Eldar in competitive play, the problematic units in the Eldar index and why they're an issue, and lastly, an analysis of the winning Eldar list at the Lone Star Open, which I think is indicative of a lot of the different lists that exist in top tournament play. Okay, so what's going on with the Eldar in competitive play? So basically, Eldar currently have well over a 60% win rate. According to GW, it's about 67%, but this varies slightly. And this hasn't changed much since the Strands of Fate nerf, which is limited to once per phase. And week after week, it comes in that the results are pretty much the same. Eldar, week after week, are winning the most tournaments. They both usually have the highest amount of first place wins, as well as the highest amount of podium placements. So, second, third place, etc. And so far, they're solidly far and above the rest of the factions in the game, with the exception of Genestealer Cult, who are probably their closest matchup. And even then, Genestealer Cult is nowhere near the Craftworld Eldar as far as tournament win percentage. And again, like I said in the beginning of the video, this has led a lot of people to complain and whine and scream about it on the internet, of course, right? Now, I'm not saying that all of these complaints are unfounded. Actually, a lot of them are very true. But I do want to address some of them because I think a lot of them are just kind of knee-jerk reactions to the Eldar being too strong, and they're not really addressing the main problems. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the common complaints. So the first complaint is that Strands of Fate is broken as a mechanic, and Eldar get way too many Fate dice. Now again, GW did nerf that. They can only use one per phase, and yet the win rate didn't really go down too far. And also keep in mind that Sisters of Battle have pretty much the same mechanic, except it's a little bit better because they can use one miracle dice per unit per phase instead of just one dice per phase. So they actually have a better special rule. However, they don't start out with as many. They have to generate them throughout the battle. which the Eldar have a little bit of a harder time doing. Again, there's only really 2 units that generate Fate dice for the Eldar, and that is Guardian Defenders and the Wraith Lord, both of which are, look at that, absent from high-level Eldar competitive play. You really don't see Guardians or Wraith Lords in top-level competitive play for the Eldar. So what's the difference between Sisters of Battle and Eldar? Well, the datasheets. Sisters of Battle don't really have great datasheets to use in conjunction with their Miracle Dice. Their best targets for Miracle Dice happen to be Multi-Meltas, which, as we all know, aren't exactly in the strongest place right now in the game. Meanwhile, the Craft-Rolled Eldar can use it on things like the Heavy Wraith Cannon on the Wraith Knight. And guess what? You use a Fate dice on that thing, and you're getting 2d6 mortal wounds out of it, which is a pretty big difference between what the Sisters can do. However, other than that, if we take datasheets aside, the Sisters of Battle actually have the army rule advantage, right? They can use 1 per unit per phase instead of just 1 per phase, like the Eldar can. So Strands of Fate isn't really the issue here, I think. GW did nerf it to once per phase, and I think that's pretty fair. And again, just to reiterate, it's not the rule itself that's broken, it's the units that are benefiting from it. People are also complaining about Eldar getting too many rerolls. Now, to this, I think this is a little bit of a silly argument because many factions in the game, pretty much every single faction, aside from a few, because I know that a few factions don't really benefit from a lot of rerolls, but there are several factions in the game besides Eldar that do. In fact, the Dark Eldar have a pretty consistent amount of rerolls in their own list, and historically they haven't really had that. So, same goes for Space Marines and same goes for Imperial Knights. Eldar have always been the faction of rerolls. They've always gotten a lot of them. They've always had things like Guide and Doom, which has provided rerolls for them. And in 8th edition, they had basically the same thing as Unparalleled Mastery, under a different name, which was called Expert Crafters. So we've actually always had rerolls like this. This is nothing new. This is nothing that should surprise people. We've always had access to this. And a lot of other factions have access to a lot of rerolls too. I mean, just look at Space Marines. A lot of their units just straight up get rerolls or other bonuses, and they have Oath of Moment, so they can basically re-roll all hits and wounds against a target once per round, which is really strong too. So again, I don't think the problem is re-rolls if more than half the factions in the game have some re-rolls in their army. The problem is that Eldar units are too efficiently costed, and I do agree with this, that people are saying that yeah, they're too efficiently costed. There's several units in the Codex right now that should be about 20 points more than they are. And those units are making every single competitive list. And this is basically the real problem with Eldar in competitive play, right? The top data sheets that people are using in tournaments are way too effective. They either benefit from broken interactions, like the Wraith Knight, or are just simply too inexpensive points-wise. So let's take a moment to talk about the problematic units in the Eldar Index and why they're an issue. So 1, the Wraith Knight. And I think personally the Wraith Knight is the biggest issue in the Eldar Index because it has the Towering Keyword, and when you mix that with the insane ranged weapons with devastating wounds that it has, so it basically has 2 36-inch range, strength 16, AP -4, 2d6 damage weapons with devastating wounds. Wow, right? That's already insane by itself. And you would think, oh, those weapons must be only single-shot weapons, right? No. They have Blast, and they're D3 plus 1 each. Yes, you heard me correctly. D3 plus 1 with the Blast special rule. So these guys basically just kill anything. They can basically see everything on the battlefield because of the Towering special rule. And yes, you could have, closed windows on the bottom story of ruins and things like that. But for the most part, you're still going to be able to see most of the units on the battlefield. And in addition to that, it's good against everything. It's good against heavy targets. It's good against light targets because it has Blast and Devastating Wounds. And as we all know, Devastating Wounds carry over. So regardless of whether you're shooting at something big or at something more horde-like, you're going to do a ton of fucking damage. And you mix this with the fact that you have a lot of shots, and you're basically guaranteeing that at least once per turn, especially with the Fate dice, you're going to get 1 to 2 devastating wound procs, which on average will be about 46 mortal wounds. So let's do some quick math. Let's say that you're firing at a Land Raider with both of your heavy Wraith cannons. You get D3 plus 1 shots apiece. So on average, that's going to be 6 shots. You get 1 reroll to hit, which means you're probably going to hit 5 of them. And out of those, you have a pretty good chance of getting a natural 6. On top of that, you can always use a 6, from a nearby Farseer for a Fate dice and basically grant another devastating wound proc. And you're also getting a single reroll to wound with Unparalleled Mastery. So you put that all together and you're basically getting between 2d6 and 46 average mortal wounds per turn out of this thing. And that's not even counting the regular damage from the other attacks. So whatever this thing hits, on average, is going to die, including other Imperial Knights. Even the bigger ones will go down to this thing with the right buffs. And it also can benefit from Guide and things like that, so you can just reroll all your hits. So it's not just one hit you can reroll. If you have Guide, you can reroll all of them. That's pretty insane. And yes, this thing is 475 points, but it's outcompeting a lot of Imperial Knights that are, quite frankly, more expensive. And because it's less than 500 points, it can start out in Strategic Reserve, which means that if your opponent has a lot of high-powered, high-strength weapons, to kill this thing, if you don't get first turn, then you could always play it safe, put it in reserve, and just have it come in turn 2. So the Wraith Knight is, in this way, very uninteractive with a lot of enemy armies, and it just does way too much damage for the points. The Fire Prism is another great example of a broken Eldar unit, not because it's, as devastating as a Wraith Knight per se, but because it has great anti-large damage and can fire through each other. So there's very little room for interaction there because you could just use, Phantasm to duck back behind cover for 1 command point each turn and be able to basically fire all 3 prisms as if they had line of sight. So yes, we did have that last edition, but prisms were also 165 points apiece last edition. So they were a little more expensive than they are now, and arguably, just straight up they are, much more reliable this edition for damage. Because they get a free reroll to hit and wound on top of the Unparalleled Mastery Detachment reroll to hit and wound. So as they are, they're probably a little bit too cheap and too efficiently costed for the amount of reliability that you get out of them. Warp Spiders are another example of a problematic unit because they can score super easily on objectives while providing great shooting in Overwatch. Again, these guys have devastating wound torrent weapons. So if opponents want to move within 12 of them to engage them properly in close combat or something like that, these guys can easily just Overwatch, do a bunch of damage to them, and then, basically trade up every single time. And also, because these guys essentially move 24 inches a turn, it's very hard to actually get them into a position where you can kill them easily. 24 inches is actually just enough range, usually, to move from one piece of obscuring terrain to the next piece of obscuring terrain where your enemy just cannot Overwatch you. So there's not really much interaction there as far as being able to stop the Warp Spiders before they're able to achieve their mission. And lastly, although I hate to say it, Shadow Specters. The reason why Shadow Specters are a little bit problematic is because they have insane damage against multiple different target types. They can deal with hordes very easily with their blast weapons, and they can also deal with heavier infantry like Terminators with their focused shot. And they're extremely efficient against both types of targets for the points. They're only 85 points for 5, and if you wanted to go bigger with these guys, you could. Now, usually competitive lists keep them at units of 5 because that's typically enough, especially since they can move, shoot, and then move again. So, again, this is one of those things where there's very little room for interaction here. They come out, they shoot an enemy unit 24 inches away, do some solid damage, hide. And yes, as an Eldar player, I do realize this is in fact what Eldar excel at, but Shadow Specters are just a little bit too cheap to be able to do that. On the other hand, if you look at a unit like Dark Eldar Scourges that are 120 points, yeah, they have heavy weapons that have a little bit more range, but they also have less armor. They also don't have -1 to hit naturally, right? They're a little bit less durable to things like indirect fire. Whereas Shadow Specters are very resilient against indirect fire for the points. They cost a lot less, and they do damage versus multiple different target types. Whereas the Scourges are basically going to be focused towards one thing, primarily anti-large. Alright, so let's go ahead and put this in perspective and do an analysis on a winning Eldar list at the Lone Star Open, which occurred in late July. So I found this list on spikybits.com, pretty good website for Warhammer 40k articles in general, and this article was done by Andrew Schrank, so thank you to him for covering this event. So the winner of this event was Ben Jurek, so congrats to Ben for winning this event. I know it's kind of a late congratulations, being almost a month later, but congrats. If you ever watch this video, good job on your victory. Now, if you look at the 6 games that he played, basically most of them are 90 points and above. So he only had 2 games really where he scored less than that, one which was 75 and one which was 88. Both are still very high scoring. And you'll basically see that a lot of top Eldar lists are scoring this way in competitive play. Alright, so here's the list. Basically, we start off with an Autarch Wayleaper, which is a staple in every competitive Eldar list for its great command point generation, and Lone Operative, basically to hide in your deployment zone safely and farm CP. That's basically the Autarch Wayleaper's job. But the Autarch Wayleaper is also a decent combatant, so if your opponent tries to sneak a small combat unit into your backlines to try to mess things up, the Autarch Wayleaper can easily take it out. The list also includes the Death Jester with Fate's Messenger, so the Death Jester has insane value being able to pick off characters or MSU infantry units with ease, and also has Lone Operative, so is hard to target. The Farseer Skyrunner boosts the firepower of units like the Wraith Knight, the Night Spinner, or the Warwalker with ease, and is hard to take out due to the Phoenix Gem. So you don't put a bodyguard on this guy, you just give him the Phoenix Gem and hide him. And again, that essentially makes him immune to most weapons in the game. The Yinkarn also waits for the right teleport opportunity, set up by the Night Spinner, Wraith Knight, or Fire Prisms. So the Yinkarn is actually included in this list, and I've actually found that quite a few lists have the Yinkarn in it. I recently did a video on the Yinkarn, and yeah, the Yinkarn is a very powerful model. And while I don't necessarily think that GW is going to nerf the Yinkarn, I do think that the Yinkarn is very powerful, and it makes sense in this list. Because this list has a lot of big units that are able to destroy units downfield very easily and open up opportunities for him to teleport in. The list also features 3 Fire Prisms, which is common for Eldar competitive lists, to maximize out-of-line-of-sight damage against hard targets. So you basically move 1 Fire Prism out, shoot a hard target downrange, move it back with Phantasm, rinse, and repeat. A Night Spinner is also included in this list because not only does it slow enemy units down, but with Guide, gets full rerolls to hit and wound, allowing it to kill small units in the backfield for the Incarn to teleport in on. And again, this is one of those combinations with the Farseer Skyrunner that you see, which make it a greater pick than just a regular Farseer on foot, because you're increasing the reliability of your units to be able to kill other units out of line of sight. So you have indirect fire weapons that are guided. Typically, you're at a -1 to hit, but because you have guide, re-rolling all of those hits, you're rarely going to miss. And when you take into account the Wraith Knight himself, which has towering, if you guide that thing, it is going to kill whatever it hits. So your opponent has to be really careful about where they place their units in the backfield, even if they're out of line of sight, because this list has a lot of indirect fire or towering units that can basically one-shot a lot of enemy infantry. It also has a unit of Shadow Spectres to deal with hordes with their Disperse Shot or finish off wounded units of Marine equivalents that are too trivial for the big stuff. So if there's a wounded unit moving up the battlefield, scoring on objectives, this is going to be the unit to take them out, because the Wraith Knight is not going to want to deal with a couple of infantry models, and of course the Night Spinner is going to want to be shooting at things farther down range. This list also features 2 Warwalkers with a scout move that can zone out light infantry. One of them has Bright Lances for big stuff if you need extra anti-tank, and one of them has Shuriken Cannons to finish off units that the Jester or Spectres can't deal with. Also, something about this that I probably assume Ben used in his games was using these Warwalkers as buffers against enemy close combat units. So the great thing about Warwalkers is they actually can tank shock and they have a decent amount of, damage they can do with this. So they can kind of get stuck into combat, hold an enemy unit down, and especially the Shuriken Cannon one can shoot in combat and still be effective against those types of targets. Which is why I assume he decided to give it Shuriken Cannons. Warwalkers are exceptionally tough in close combat against most enemy units. If you think about it, it has toughness 6, but most enemy units don't have great combat weapons unless you're charging into something with power fists. Most likely, they're going to be wounding it on a 5+. And with its innate -1 to wound ability, it's going to be wounding on a 6, so it can actually hold enemy infantry up for some time. And let me give you a quick example of this. Just think about if you're going against something like an Orc list that has a lot of Orc infantry that's being thrown at you. Normally, Wraith Knights and Fire Prisms would not be able to deal with that Orc infantry fast enough before it could get to you. With the wall and all, Orcs can actually be pretty fast. But if you have a couple of Warwalkers that you can throw into some mobs of Orc boys to hold them up into combat for a couple turns, that's going to give your Wraith Knight, your Fire Prisms, your Shadow Spectres, and your other units more time to deal with those enemies. So having 2 Warwalkers in this list, I think, is a tech against those types of armies. But I may be wrong. If you have a different opinion about why Ben included these 2 units in his list, let me know in the comment section. He also has Warp Spiders, of course, for objective play and solid mortal wound damage. And, that basically works against any target. So if you need 3 wounds dealt to an enemy unit, well, you throw Warp Spiders at it because they can do devastating wounds against anything. And if you just need them to score objectives, they can move 24 inches and are basically untouchable from there. Lastly, big surprise, it's basically in every Eldar competitive list, you have the Big Daddy Wraith Knight with 2 heavy Wraith Cannons for obliterating any hard targets with ease. You have a Fate dice plus enough shots for a natural 6 to occur each turn on average, which converts into about 4d6 mortal wounds to any target plus its normal damage, like I said earlier in this video. And also remember that this Wraith Knight could easily be guided by the Farseer Skyrunner to reroll all of its hits, to make sure that you get the maximum amount of chances to get that 6 to wound with devastating wounds. And just for the fuck of it, it has 2 Star Cannons as well, just to, basically rub some fucking salt into the wounds of your dead opponents. Okay, so let's do a quick list analysis. So the list has insane damage against hard targets between the Wraith Knight and Triple Prism. There's very little hard targets in the game that can survive against this. It has solid objective play as well with the Warp Spiders and other elements. Later in the game, the Farseer Skyrunner, Autarch Wayleaper, and Death Jester can all perform objectives effectively. Lastly, the list is very hard to shoot at or engage in close combat. With a mix of lone operatives, move shoot move units like the Fire Prism with Phantasm or the Shadow Spectres, and combat buffers like the Warwalkers to prevent a lot of, fast moving infantry from getting engaged with your more powerful units, there's really very little room for any opponent to react or even engage the Eldar in a favorable manner. And there's not a lot of armies out there that can deal with this type of list and this type of uninteraction. So I think one of the lists that can possibly deal with this is Genestealer Cult. Just because they have hypermobility in the form of Deep Strike and have really expendable units that can then resurrect wherever they want, whereas the Eldar units cannot. So I do think a really good Genestealer Cult list run by an exceptional player could give this list a run for its money, but even then, it's not guaranteed, right? This list still has a number of ways to deal with Horde units and a lot of mobility to deal with the never-ending Genestealer Cult tokens, which can be countered pretty easily by fast-moving units. So there is that. Okay, so in conclusion, are Eldar broken in competitive play? Well, unfortunately, yes. The top competitive lists running the best units are extremely oppressive, and there's not much a lot of armies out there can do about it. And especially when these elements are combined into one list, they play off each other perfectly and leave armies with very little room to fight back or even engage the Eldar at all. While I don't believe this is a fate dice or detachment issue, so, having those rerolls army-wide, I think is fine for a detachment special rule. Keep in mind that other armies have powerful detachment rules as well. I agree that nerfs to the top units are needed. And I do want to go into this a little bit because I mentioned it before, and I basically think the same thing as I thought the last video. The Wraith Knight having Towering with Devastating Wounds together is an oppressive combination. But there's other oppressive things that support the Wraith Knight because the Wraith Knight alone can't do everything, right? It's a very powerful unit, obviously very tough, very hard hitting. But without any supporting elements, the Wraith Knight has the potential to fall flat. So what exactly is needed to rein in the Eldar effectively? Well, I think you need to start by admitting that the Towering keyword is a little bit too oppressive. And any unit with really powerful shooting and the Towering keyword is going to be able to just absolutely decimate enemy armies before they get the chance to do anything. And that's a really toxic interaction. I don't know if any of you guys remember 5th edition, where true line of sight reigned and basically nothing was safe from enemy shooting. But I did. I ran an Eldar army in 5th edition where there was true line of sight and basically you could see everything on the board. And let me tell you, it was extremely hard to run anything except mechanized lists because everything was just so vulnerable to shooting. And we don't want to create a scenario where it's essentially the same thing, right? We've improved since then. The game system has gotten better, things have gotten more balanced, and as a result, we don't want things that can just take units off the board turn 1 without any counterplay. So I do believe Towering needs to be changed or at least tweaked to be more balanced. And the Wraith Knight probably needs another increase in points. And even though I hate to say that, because the Wraith Knight is one of those units that, yes, with the heavy Wraith cannons, it's super oppressive, but its other configurations are not. A Sun Cannon is perfectly balanced, and the Ghost Glaive or Titanic Ghost Glaive and Scatter Shield are also very balanced options that aren't anywhere near OP. So it does pain me to say that, but I think the Wraith Knight, for the sake of the competitive scene, needs to be a little bit more expensive. Maybe 505 so you can't put it in reserve. And that's it, right? Just so you can't put it in strategic reserve at the start of the game, limit it in that way, and either make the Eldar player pay a Prince Riel tax to buy Prince Riel to be able to move it into reserve, or, otherwise you just can't put it in reserve because it's too many points. The other thing I think they should fix is the point cost of some of the most competitive Eldar units. Things like Warp Spiders and Shadow Specters should be 20 more points per unit. Making sure that they're still viable and they're still good, but they're just not undercosted for what they can do. I would also not be opposed to them changing the Devastating Wounds keyword on D weapons to something else. Now, I know that may seem a little bit shocking to some of you because the lore of the D cannon is, yes, it rips you right into the warp. And yes, it should cause devastating mortal wounds, right? But it's just a little bit too insane, right? It feels really like the lore, and when you're playing a strategic game like Warhammer 40k on the tabletop, you don't want the stuff to feel exactly like it does in the lore. Super overpowered, right? We don't want that. So, to be real, I think that losing Devastating Wounds on the D weapons and gaining something else wouldn't be a bad thing. And I think actually, personally, having anti-vehicle or anti-monster 2+ on D weapons would be a good trade-off. And yeah, it wouldn't be as OP, it wouldn't be as powerful, obviously, as Devastating Wounds. But in my mind, it would be a good middle ground that both players would be okay with, right? Yeah, if you're shooting at a monster or vehicle, it's going to be really strong, but at least if you're shooting at infantry, it's not going to be as efficient. And then that way you don't have to nerf Strands of Fate itself and inadvertently gimp the entire index, right? Because there are units in the Eldar index right now that are not super OP, they're just good, and I think they should remain that way. I think that's fine, right? We want good units in every index. We just don't want super OP units who have no counterplay, right? That's what we're trying to get rid of. And when the nerfs come in September, I hope GW keeps this in mind. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to become a Patreon member, I have free trials activated so you can join at no cost to you. Patreon membership gives you infinite and unlimited access to our Discord community, which is a growing community of Eldar enthusiasts who like talking about Eldar strategy, tactics, and of course hobbying. If you do want to join, the link is in the description. I do also have a channel store page for those of you looking to rep your favorite faction in your local game store. I will leave the link for that in the description, as well as my Amazon affiliate link for those of you who want to support the channel by maybe purchasing some new Eldar miniatures. And I have to say, the Eldar Combat Patrol on Amazon is pretty cheap. I think it's only about $113. So if you are in the market for that, definitely check out the link in the description. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time. Have some great games this week, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.